Good morning. So we're following through on this theme of the early church moving out from Jerusalem. Remember in chapter 1, Jesus said, you will go out from Jerusalem, Samaria, and onto the ends of the earth. They're moving out and meeting others, and what happens in these meetings. And in a sense, they're reflecting God, because God is always moving out towards us and meeting us. And the early church have been doing that. And at today's point, it's got Paul into big trouble. If you want to read chapter 25 and 26, all of it, you can see that this moving out, this meeting others, has got Paul into a whole lot of trouble. There's been an attempt on his life. He's been arrested rather than the people who were attempting his life. He's been arrested for stirring up trouble. And he finds himself in a courtroom situation with a Roman official adjudicating, Festus, and a king, a Jewish king, King Agrippa. And he's supposed to be giving a defense. I don't know how many of us have ever been in a courtroom setting. I was summoned to a judge, to appear before a judge once before. I'm not going to tell you why. And it's terrifying to have to give an account of what I will say was a relatively minor misdemeanor. And you're supposed to give a defense that might help you. But Paul instead gives his testimony. He sees this as an occasion to give his testimony. And his testimony, this is the third time that he's given it in the book of Acts. Paul's testimony is recorded 3 times. And in some sense, it's become a bit of a pattern for testimonies. It has a before and after thing. What I was like before a meeting with Jesus and what I was like afterwards. Lots of testimonies go like this. Before, things weren't great, or I wasn't great. After, things got better, or I improved dramatically. Something of this type. The difference that faith makes. Not every testimony is like that, but many are, and this has become a bit of a model. And if you don't have that as a model, sometimes you feel a bit guilty. You think, I wish I had a slightly better story to tell. And when I was younger, I was always making up things that were in the bad camp, because I grew up in a Christian family, a bit like Elise, and I didn't have enough sort of raw material for the before section. And it came as a bit of a relief to me to find that not every testimony in the scriptures has that before and after quite so boldly. You could, when Bernice came to speak about Peter meeting with Cornelius, Cornelius didn't have much of a before. Before, I was praying, I was seeking God. Then I met with Jesus, and my faith filled out. It became something that I felt like God had really got hold of. But it's not quite. There's more of a continuity, I suppose. And in some senses, we heard that with Elise today, a continuity. I grew up in a Christian family. I learned the faith. And then, in moments like this, I owned it for myself. And that will have been made up, that story, by the same sort of thing of my life was interrupted by God in different ways until I made my own confession of faith. And perhaps growing up in a Christian family just makes us more alert to those moments. We recognize them. Just like Samuel in the Old Testament being taught. When this happens, say, "Here I am, Lord. Speak," because I'm listening. Other people don't have that and have this more Paul thing. And it would be interesting to know how many of us resonate with which story. But Paul has definitely got this, if you like, big story. I was really taken with the maths interruption. I think that's the kind of faith I want. But in actual fact, there's something about it, isn't it? That my faith meant I could step out of the pressure of this, look for guidance, look for help, calm myself, and receive light. But next time I come to a maths issue, I'm definitely going on that. So, but the important thing is that this question of interruptions, big or small, this belief that Jesus interrupts our lives and makes claims on us. And Paul has the big story of that. And his story was that he was very religious and also super intolerant. It's an interesting combination already. Very religious, but super intolerant. Prepared to think and act on the idea that those who weren't like him, who didn't think like him, who didn't behave like him, who had different convictions, needed putting right. Paul was an extremist because he thought they needed punishing. He thought they needed imprisoning. He thought some of them should be put to death. You know, this is the big story. That's the road he was travelling on. And look around the world, we probably don't have to look very far and think, yeah, this is not an old problem. The government recently has been quibbling over what support for a terror organisation is allowed and not allowed. Paul would have made the task very easy for the government. He wasn't holding a poster saying, I condemn Jesus followers. He was embodying what we would, and what the government's trying to grapple with now, a terrorist ideology. He was on his way to imprison Christians. And at that point, his life was interrupted. At that point, as he's on his way, I wanted to say he's on his horse because I always picture him falling off a horse, but I'm fairly certain that a horse never gets mentioned. So, but I like the picture. It's a bit more dramatic. He was on his horse and he fell off of it. And he says this in his court case. He says, I saw a light much brighter than the sun coming from the sky and shining around me and the men travelling with me. And all of us fell to the ground, and I heard a voice say to me in Hebrew, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? You are hurting yourself by hitting back, like an ox kicking against its owner's stick. Who are you, Lord? I asked, and the Lord answered, I am Jesus. That was the interruption. There's a funny little phrase that Jesus uses. Why are you hurting yourself by hitting back like an ox kicking against its owner's stick? Why are you, as the older versions have, why are you kicking against the goads? It hurts to kick against goads. And just want to get that little notion. There was the goads, or the stick, was that people guiding animals used to have these big sticks, maybe even with the odd sort of spike on them, just to shift them along. And if an animal was stubborn, it would kick against them. But obviously, kicking against the stick didn't hurt anyone but the animal. Why are you persecuting me? It's hurting you to kick against this. And the picture might be something like, it's tiring to swim against the stream, to swim against the tide. You know, I'm guiding you one way, and you want to go the other way. You've grown up in a life of faith, and it's leading you into a dead end, not to life, but to death, the death of others even. Why are you doing this, Saul? Why are you kicking against the goads? It's painful to do that. It's hard to work against the grain. It's tough to swim against the tide, Saul. That's what Jesus is saying to him. Maybe for all of your religious conviction, you are forcing a way of life that is against the grain of faith, against the tide of my goodness. It can only hurt you and others. And Paul tells this story of his own life being interrupted by Jesus, who is the Lord. And he knows that, if you like, he says, in just the brief words he says to the king, he knows if he's telling the story of his own life, but he's fitting it into the even bigger story of Jesus' life. And in a sense, that's the purpose of our testimonies, how we hold our own life stories close to Jesus and see what difference that makes. Because the scriptures tell us, because the gospel said it makes the difference. And Paul has a big story. It's got a dramatic story. But he holds it next to the story of Jesus, which is much, much bigger, which is universal, which touches everything. And you can sum up the big story in just a couple of words here, because Paul summarizes it. And he says basically two things. The big story is this, that the Messiah must suffer. He said, I've picked that up from the scriptures, and I've met with Jesus. The Messiah must suffer. Jesus, the Christ, must suffer. So that suffering isn't a lonely, terrible thing out there, but it's something that God is in the midst of. It's not the end, neither in terms of death or the dysfunction that it brings, but it is something that God is in the middle of. And so, for me, instead of folding and collapsing in defeat and despair, I can look to Jesus and say, even here, even in the worst of things, there's a meeting with God, the God who made me, the God who loves me. There is no place out of bounds. Talk about moving out. You're saying, well, Jesus has moved right into the very heart of the worst bits of life. And that's coupled with the second bit. And he must be the first to rise from the dead. Preposterous. This is the thing that kept on causing problems in his preaching. But he said, no, it must be the case. And the scriptures have always promised this. And why? Because we need to know that God is always ahead of us. That it's not death, it's not dysfunction, it's not a gradual petering out and my mistakes catching up with me and my body giving out. That's not what's ahead. And it's not the winning of the violent and those who would rally life into experiences of domination and defeat. They look around the world, Paul was set on that path. And we know it's about us. He said, no, we need to know this rising from the dead. God is ahead of us. God is reweaving a broken world, where it feels like it's breaking down, and where it is, where there is every evidence of it breaking down. The resurrection stands as a testimony and a promise that God is reweaving the world, and God is healing our lives. Our lives tend towards the life that God has promised and will give in the resurrection of the body. We said it in the creed, and Jesus is the outpost of that, of saying this is where we are headed. This is what God has put ahead of us. And it's critically important. It was important for Paul because his life was going somewhere else. It was tending towards violence, death, all of these things. And it's critical for us to get this in the midst of war, of grief, of illness. God is working for life. And when God interrupts us, it's because God is first of all gifting us life. He's telling us that's what's ahead, but he's also recruiting us. For when Elise made a promise, I'll tell you, it's always a thing to hear about what you've promised after you've promised. But when you make a promise to say, will you serve God in the world? It's this, will you be hooked on life? Will you live your life tending towards the life that you see in Jesus? Because that is the future. That's what God promises. And sometimes it's easy for us to say yes to that because life might be good. And sometimes it's incredibly tough because life is hard. And there are places in the world now that shout out that that's not true. And in those worst of places, there are people who know it is true and who are living that truth and experiencing that truth. And that's the same here in the toughest places. There's that sense that God is reweaving. And we hold on to that in the good and the bad. And that's what Paul says, that simply that's the gospel. That's the story I'm fitting my life into. I was interrupted and I found that God was in the worst of it in the person of Jesus. God got into the worst of it and God opened out a promise of life that I am living towards. And from that, he makes a few inferences. He says, And that means light, not darkness, for all. It's not just light for me. He's looking at the king and he's looking at the Roman official and he's looking around. He says, great and small, you bigwigs, you others. It's light for all, not darkness. It's forgiveness, not condemnation for all. It's sanctification, not disintegration for all. And we just take sanctification just to mean shorthand, mending. It's a mending of our lives. And he said that's for everyone, that's for all of us. That's the big story. It's the presence of Jesus and not the power of Satan for all. That's what he says, the big story. He says, my story has got latched onto the big story of Jesus. Entering suffering, being raised to bring light and life. Paul's big story needs to be washed through with this even bigger story. Why? Because it's too painful to kick against the goads. Anything else is swimming against the stream, and it is exhausting. But Jesus says, follow me. Don't swim against the tide, follow me. And as that's what we've had a little moment of this. It's a lovely thing to hear a testimony, the beginnings of a testimony, where we look at our own stories, big or small, and we realize they need to be rinsed through. That story of Jesus, his death and his resurrection. I read Paul and I always think my story is a bit small. It's not got that many sort of dramatic instances. It doesn't matter. It's a question of life being healed, of life making sense when it is saturated in the story of Jesus. And not just once. It's not that moment of beginning. This is the third time that Paul tells his story. The third time. And he adds a new word on this third retelling. To this day, I have been helped. This is an ongoing story. This God in the midst of the tough times, this God reweaving life. It didn't just happen at the start. You come back to it all the time. All the time. This is what God gives. And in fact, it's a neat little thing in this story because he says, to this day I've been helped. And then there's a response from the officials. Because Festus just hears it and says, you've gone mad, Paul. This is lunacy. You're supposed to be defending yourself so you get out of trouble when you're just going through your old story again. It's madness. He's not having any of it. And he turns to the king and he says, in effect, to the king, well, you can read on from this, he says to the king, you believe it, don't you? Where's your story fit into the story of Jesus? I've told you where my story fits in. And this is crucial. It's part of the sharing of our lives with people. I've told you where my story fits in and what Jesus, how it's aligned with Jesus. What about you? What about your story? How does it map on to Jesus? Is it rinsed through that experience of life out of death, of meeting God in the suffering and moving on? And the king doesn't give a response. He just says, in modern versions, he says, are you trying so quickly to convince me to be a Christian? And Paul says, would that you were. Would that you were. In the old versions, it says, the king responds, almost you persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul says still, would that you were. Because all of our stories find their sense in the story of Jesus, where Jesus meets us at our worst and opens up the life of God for us, bringing light to all of us. And so, when we hear a testimony, and it's been beautiful to hear it today, when we hear a testimony, just have that ringing in the back, whether for the first or the second time. Almost you convince me to be a Christian. Would that you were. Because it's painful to kick against the goads. It's exhausting to swim against the tide. So when Jesus calls, we follow. Amen.